Hi there, I am Mary Pat O'Neill, and I'm an independent college counselor in Redmond. And all that basically means is that I help families with the college process. I also volunteer my services through the Lake Washington Schools Foundation. I've been doing this for a number of years, and I created the Find Your Fit program. And what Find Your Fit does is just help students, again, with the college process. And one of the things that I offer through Find Your Fit are essay workshops for students. And it came to my attention that by talking to teachers, that a lot of teachers are asked to teach their seniors or and maybe even junior students about how to write college essays, but that many teachers have not had any training on this. And so I thought what I would do is modify the webinar that I do for students, but make it more for teachers. So I'll be talking differently to you than I would to a student. So I hope that you find this useful. Please know that I'm a resource within the community, and I'm happy to be of any help that I can. So I'm hoping that in today's session that what you walk away with is having a better understanding of the role of the college essay in the application process, understanding why the essay is important, the different types and structures of essays, the mechanics of writing essays. I'll give some essay examples and then some editing tips. So just to bring everybody up to speed as to what goes into a college application, I always make the joke that my life would be so much easier if everybody would just simply do things the same way, but they don't. There's about 1,900 four-year public and private colleges in the United States, and there's 5 possible things that they will ask for in a college application. I'll just briefly go through them with you. The first one is a student's high school transcript. This one is always required. No one can get into a four-year college without one. Some colleges want standardized test scores like the ACT or the SAT. Again, this has changed quite dramatically over the last few years with COVID. University of Washington, Washington State, University of California, Cal State schools, they don't use test scores in admissions. Some colleges would like to see a student's high school activity list, and this is just basically a resume that a student puts together starting in 9th grade as to what they do when they're not in school and they're not doing homework. This is one many of you may know, letters of recommendation. Again, this is something that high school teachers are asked to write. I hope students ask you politely. I always tell them to do that. Again, but a lot of schools don't require them. The Washington State Public Schools, Cal State, UCs, again, they don't ask for letters of rec. And thank you for those of you who do write letters of rec, because I know it is a ton of work. And then the final piece of the application puzzle would be the college essay or essays, because again, it depends on the student's college list. And I'm just here to show you these next couple screens. This is a college data website. It's called College Data, and it shows the admissions scattergram for every college, and it shows what's very important, considered, and not considered in the admission process. And I just thought I would show you a few of these so that you can get a sense of this. So here's the University of Washington, the Seattle campus. You can see that the essay is very important. This is Washington State University. It is not considered, and that's because the Washington State University application does not have an essay. However, if a student was going to apply to their honors college, there are essays required for that. Here's UCLA. You can see that they too also consider the essay important. So it's going to depend on a student's college list, but there are certainly a lot of great colleges that don't require essays. And a student's grades, the rigor, the academics, that is almost always going to be the most important. Again, essays can be important too, but where an essay can make a big difference for a student is when a college is looking at applicants with similar data points. Oh, you have a 4.0. Oh, you have good test scores. And it helps. Telling a good story can help make a difference in the application process. Whereas I always tell students, you could write the world's best essay, but if you don't have the grades and the rigor, UW is just not likely to consider you. So here's some things I always tell students to remember when they're thinking about this whole process. So colleges are businesses. They're not charities, and students need to remember this. And a lot of what I'm going to be saying here has to do with the more selective schools or colleges. I define selective as schools that accept less than 25% of the applicants. And where we live, we know that we have a lot of high achieving students who are doing that. But colleges are creating a freshman class, and they're looking, for things, and they don't share what they're looking for. And that's why sometimes when this is over with, a student might say, my grades were better, my test scores were better, I thought everything was better, but my friend got in. And it's like, yeah, I understand. It's hard. It's a non-transparent and often an unfair process for those more selective schools. Students need to remember, I stress this a number of times in this session, they don't know who's reading their essay, and that's important to keep in mind. College applications, which includes the essays, are read very, very quickly. It is amazing, especially at the more selective schools. They just have so many applications to read. The University of Washington, I think their readers have to get through about 8 an hour. That's not just the essay, that's the entire application. And those applications are long. UPenn spends about 5 minutes per essay. And so students need to keep that in mind, that they are being read very, very quickly. And I always tell students, make sure your application's authentic and it represents them. And this is why I feel so strongly about having a very balanced college list, not having it all weighted into, the most selective, and to trust the process. And I do remind students that their applications, their essays are being read by humans. And by nature, that means it's subjective. We're humans. And even though people are trained not to, that's why you don't know who's reading your essay, and they could just have a bias, even though they're trained not to. And for a lot of students, the college process may be the first time that they actually receive rejection on something. Teens, we all, I love working with teens. I'm sure you love working with teens. Their brain's not fully formed yet. And they tend to be very linear in their approach about life. If I do this, if I do this, if I do this, I'm guaranteed this result. And the college process may be the first time that they realize that that's not true. And these are some of the great colleges that don't have essays, as I said. I mentioned Washington State, also Arizona State. They have wonderful honors programs. These other schools probably do too. And they do require essays to apply to those. So the role of an essay, it's threefold in my opinion. The first one is to leave a positive impression of the student. The essay is the last part of a college application. And so when they're done, we want the reader to feel good about the student and to want them on their campus. It's also a chance for the student to show their character and their personality. I mentioned the other parts. I firmly believe that a student's transcript and test scores, if they have them, they don't reflect character and personality. I know some wonderful kids who work really hard and their test scores or grades don't reflect that. Other kids, they're blessed with the ability to do well on standardized testing. An activity list can show a little bit about a student's character and personality. However, the space is very limited. On the Common App, which many colleges use, students are limited to 150 characters per activity. A letter of rec, if it's allowed, hopefully talks a little bit about a student's character and personality, but students aren't supposed to see their letters of rec, so they don't know what a teacher is saying. And again, a lot of colleges don't allow letters of rec. So that leaves the essay to show a student's character and personality. And this last one, and I hope that by the time we're done today, you'll have a better understanding of what I mean by this. And students get very intimidated when I say this, but it's very doable. And I hope this will make sense by the end. But the student's goal is to tell a story that they are the only person in the world who can tell it. I always tell students that their goal is to have their essay be read. And I think all of them roll their eyes at me and go, well, duh, Mary Pat. However, what I mean by that is in order to be read, an essay must be readable. And as somebody who reads essays, and I'm sure you feel the same way too if you read students' essays, they don't all start out readable. I mentioned earlier how fast college applications are read. If an admissions person is reading the first paragraph of a student's essay and is scratching their head going, what? I don't understand this. They're not going to sit there and spend 25 minutes deciphering it and putting pieces together from different paragraphs. Oh, this is what the student's trying. They can't. They don't have the time. Remember, I had mentioned how fast students' essays are read. And this is one reason why I tell students to make sure that they have a balanced list, because if a student's a strong applicant, great grades, maybe test scores, interesting activities, all that stuff, most colleges in the United States accept most of the students who apply. So that shouldn't be a problem. However, with more selective schools, and the term highly selective means too many qualified students applying for too few of spots. And if they've got too many qualified students and they're looking to say no to qualified students, an unreadable essay can be one of the very first reasons to reject an application. So it needs to be readable. Students need to be the center of the universe in their essays. They can have other people in their essays, but they have to be the star. And it's because they are the ones who are applying to college. I teach my students that there's two different types of statements. There's what I call a tell statement, and then there's what I call a show statement. And they're both important. I don't know if you can see my arms waving here. A tell statement might be something like, I'm a leader. I like to help people. I like dogs, whatever. But if in an essay, a student is telling a college something about them, they need to prove it. And this is what I call anecdotal proof. Oh, so, you have all these leadership positions, you made these changes, you have 20 dogs, you foster dogs or whatever. But when I'm editing essays, I often give that feedback. You're telling me, please prove it, because that is important, because a lot of people can tell colleges things. Oh yeah, I'm a leader too, but maybe I have no proof. So that could be an exercise that you do with your students, is tell them to describe themselves and then to give some proof. An example that I give, one of the things that I feel strongly about is the inequity in education. And I happen to be a first generation. And one of the ways that I try my own little part to combat this is why I volunteer with the Lake Washington Schools Foundation, because I know that the students who can hire college counselors like myself are the same students who have lots of benefits, whereas there's a lot of other students who don't understand the process. There's just, it's hard, and the public schools have so many students, and it's just hard for one college counselor to get to everybody. And so that's why I try to do my little part. So that's my proof that inequity in education bothers me. So college essays tend to fall into, I don't know what the word is, like storylines, I guess I'll use. And I'll go through them here with you. The first one is a student has had a challenge, and the challenge leads the student to whatever it is that they want to study, or a career that they want to have after college. And the example that I give students is this. So I was born with a genetic eye condition. It's called nystagmus. And what it basically means is that I was born without a lens in each of my eyes. And these lenses are what help people see. So when I was born, the doctors thought I was blind. I'm not blind, but I will admit that sight is my weakest of my 5 senses. To compensate for not having these lenses, my eyes have to move back and forth. If my eyes don't move back and forth, I can't see. And so growing up, I was made fun of a lot by kids. They would call me wiggly eyes. And my friends to this day still tease me that when I'm mad, I look like Darth Vader because I've got the laser beam eyes. And in my day, when you did driver's training, you did it through your high school in the summertime. And on the very last day of driver's ed, they would turn the cafeteria into the Department of Licensing, and everybody would sit and take the written test. And then we all lined up for the vision test. And I think most of you understand this, but when you take the vision test, you have to stick your head up against a little box and read the wall chart. Well, my eyes can't move in that little box. And so I remember being very humiliated because I was the only one who failed it, and it was in front of all my peers and all that. A few years later, I was at a doctor's appointment, and my nystagmus came up in the conversation. And I told the doctor that when I looked in the mirror, my eyes don't move. And so that's why I was always confused why people made fun of me and all these problems that I was having. And he was intrigued by that. And he asked me to look in the mirror with him, and we did. And he asked me if my eyes were moving, and I told him no. And he's like, oh, that's fascinating, because they were, but my brain tells me that they're not. So I could tell that story to a college and say, and that's why I want to study neuroscience, because I want to understand the connection between the brain and the body. So I had some sort of a challenge, and this challenge led me to whatever it is I want to study. Now in B, it's not about a challenge, but a student knows what they want to study. And so an example of this could be computer science. Got a lot of those kids who want to study computer science. So, I might ask a student, okay, well, tell me 3 characteristics. They can give more if they wanted to, but tell me the characteristics of somebody who would be really good at computer science. And they might say, oh, a really good critical thinker, problem solver, works well in a team, and is patient. Okay. And then what I would have the student do is, okay, work backwards and give me an example. Again, the anecdotal proof of you being a good problem solver, your ability to work well in a team, and that the fact that you're patient. Ergo, you will be a fabulous computer scientist because you possess those qualities. Now in C, a student has had a challenge, and we're going to talk more about challenges in a little bit. And challenges can be a good college essay topic. But anyways, a student has had a challenge. The challenge has nothing to do with what they want to study, but they want the college to know about this challenge. And a good example that I have is a number of years ago, I worked with a student. We were talking about challenges. And when she was in 9th grade, her mother was diagnosed with a very serious cancer. Her mother lived, she was healthy, all was great. But as a college counselor, the last essay I want to read is about how brave and strong her mom was, how much she loves her mom. Although it's all true, but the girl's applying to college, not her mom. And so I said to her, okay, let's rethink this. Tell me, how were you impacted by your mother's diagnosis? And she mentioned a few little things, but the major thing that happened to her was that her mom had micromanaged her. Her mom would go on to Skyward every day and go, oh, I see you have a test in a few days. I will quiz you. I see you have a paper due. Let me read it. I'll edit it. Oh, there's a project, and the student would do whatever her mom told her to do, and her mom kept her in line. Well, when her mother became sick, Skyward was not on her things to do list anymore. And this poor girl floundered. She had no idea how to do time management or anything, and her grades went right down the toilet. Now, 10th grade, 11th grade, she turned it around. She was a fabulous student. But that one semester of lower grades really impacted it. And when on college applications, they ask what's a student's cumulative GPA at the end of junior year. And even though things had turned around, that one semester didn't make it as strong as it should be. And she wanted them to understand the story behind it, not just look at a number. And then D has nothing to do with a challenge. It has nothing to do with what a student wants to study. It's simply a story that the student wants to tell. And I will give you an example of that toward the end. You guys teach this all the time. There's two structures of essays. There's the narrative and the montage. Narrative is very straightforward, cause and effect. One moment leads to the next. What I stress to the students, though, is that if they haven't changed and grown through this narrative, it isn't a narrative. They have to be a different version of themselves at the end. A montage is a little bit different. And again, I don't know why I'm telling it to you guys. You are the teachers. But anyways, it has a theme. Everything's related and condensed. And the example I give, I had a student a number of years ago who wanted to study business, and he wanted to write about that, why he wanted to study business in his college essay. And he chose the montage. And so I said to him, okay, tell me the very first time you thought to yourself, ooh, I want to study business. And that's the cool thing about our stories. Well, sometimes we have to remember them. For the most part, we know them because they're our stories. We don't have to work too hard. And this kid knew immediately. He's like, oh, I was 7. I was playing Zoo Tycoon. I was like, awesome. So he wrote, a paragraph about whatever Zoo Tycoon taught him. And then I said, what happened next? He goes, oh, I took personal finance in 10th grade. Boy, oh boy, did I love that class. And so he wrote about that and what he learned. Then the third thing was about his first real job that he had at the Sammamish YMCA, and he talked about the principles of business he learned there. And then his final paragraph, before he got to the conclusion, was about how he loved Shark Tank and his favorite shark was Mark Cuban. And again, everything that he learned. That's a great example of a montage. So I mentioned earlier, and I know I already talked about this, and I'm going to show you again, but I stressed to the students about having their essay reflect their character and their personality. And again, this is that scattergram from college data. And you can see in both cases here, the essay is very important. The school on the left, school on the left, essay is very important as it is for the other school. But a little bit further down, you see the term character and personal qualities. So again, a transcript doesn't show that. A test score doesn't show that. Activities can maybe give a little bit, but again, the limited character count, it can't do a whole lot of work there. Letters of rec certainly can, if there are a letter of rec, and if if the writer of the letter talks about their character and personality, but we don't know because students can't see them. So again, that's the essay's job, and the essay does a lot of weight, I think, in the college process. You can see the school on the right, the character and personal qualities is very important. And I am not one to go on and on about highly selective schools to my students, because I know that most students aren't going to be accepted. There's just not enough space for them, even though they're all qualified. But the school on the left is UCLA, the school on the right is Stanford. And as I always tell students, if character and personal qualities is important to these schools, it's likely important to many others. So now let's talk about the mechanics of writing a college essay, because it is very different than what most students are used to writing in high school. So there's basically two different types of essays. One is called the personal statement, and that's where students should start. That's probably what a lot of you work with your students on. And then the other one would be supplemental essays. So what I'm going to say here applies to pretty much every essay. It doesn't matter if it's a personal statement or if it is a supplemental essay. So one of the things that admissions people constantly say is that they want to hear a student's voice. And what I always say, if there's a voice, somebody has to be talking. So if you happen to be a reader, I happen to be a reader. I love to read. I read more fiction than I do nonfiction. But what I've noticed is that when I'm reading a novel, the characters in the books, when they speak, they have voices in my head. And I always ask students if they hear that, and they're all like, yeah, I do. So the same thing will happen, hopefully, in a student's college essay if they write it this way. And this is very different, as I said, than what most students are used to doing. So I tell students to write it as if they were speaking to somebody, not writing an English paper, but as if they're talking to somebody, to make it very conversational. I do sometimes have to tell students you can't use terms like gonna or swear, which sometimes they do, and I laugh at that. But but as if they're talking to somebody, that's very conversational. And I'm going to demonstrate something here that I show students. You may or may not want to share this with students, but hopefully what you're seeing here is a blank Word document. Google offers the same thing. In Word, it's called the dictate function. And what I tell students to do is, once they have figured out the story that they want to tell to a college, because that's basically what a college essay is. It's storytelling. It's conversational storytelling. And just like they would if they were given a presentation at school, I tell kids, you should practice it a few times. That's what I do. Even if just to make a recording on my voicemail, I have to practice it a few times. But once a student does that and they feel good to go, they should use the dictate function for their first draft, not the first draft they're going to turn into you or give to me, but their first draft. And the reason why, when you use dictate, it doesn't put in any punctuation or capitalization. It'll basically just be one long word. Students will mess up. We all do. And they'll start laughing at themselves. The software will pick that up. They'll say, oh, I screwed up, but that'll pick up. But they can go through and it'll give them a strong first draft of how they talk versus how they write. There is a very big difference. And I'm just going to demonstrate this here. And one thing I have to say, the software for this on Word and Google is very good. Very different than when I try to dictate into my phone. I'm always amazed at the words that they think I'm saying, because I'm not. But I'm just going to start something here. Growing up, I was very shy. When I was in 10th grade, my parents told me that they had bought a new house located about 5 blocks away. Unfortunately, it was in a different school district. And the last thing that I wanted to do was to change high schools. So this is what I tell students to do for their first draft, just to get it in their voice. Then they can go through and edit it properly. But I hope you find that interesting. Students have to be the center of the universe, because they're the ones applying to college. They have to write in first person, which is very hard. As I work with my seniors over the summer, they're like, oh my gosh, it's so hard to write about myself. And then I want to hear my students' voices, but when you're reading it, hopefully you hear your students' voices too, and it makes a really big difference. So let's talk about the personal statement. It is generic. And what I mean by that is, we'll talk about conclusions in personal statements in a few minutes. There has to be a conclusion. But where in a personal statement, it's generic in the sense that students need to connect the conclusion to college, but not to a specific college. So you wouldn't say, and at the University of Washington or whatever, it's just the generic college essay. The word count is 650 words. As I said, the conclusion ties to college, not to a specific college. Students always ask me, Mary Pat, what is the good prompt? What is the bad prompt? And I'll show you the prompts in just a minute. You've probably looked at them yourselves, maybe given them to students, but I don't know about you, but I think they are the most generic things I've ever read in my life. And so that's why I tell kids, don't worry about the prompt. Focus on your story. Once you have your story done, look at the prompts and see which one you think it matches best. And I always tell students, hey, if you need help, let me know. I'll give you my opinion. But number 7 is share any story you want. I mean, you can't get more generic than that. And of course, kids are like, well, isn't that the lame prompt? No, it's not the lame prompt. I want to put it in there. So, and then some students may need more than one personal statement. And again, you may or may not have to talk to students about this, but I just want you to understand, but I'll go through that in a little bit. So there's different application platforms that colleges use. Some colleges do have their own platforms, like the University of California and Cal State. Common App is the most frequently used. The University of Washington has moved to it. Actually, I noticed that all Washington State public universities are using the Common App now. That doesn't mean that if a student is applying to Washington State that they can't use Washington State's own application. They can, but just know UW is using the Common App this year for the first time. Coalition was what UW used to use, but they're not using it this year. So I don't know that any students actually would use the Coalition. And I tell students, if colleges offer multiple platforms for applications, they just pick one and use the one that is most frequently used with all their college list. So some of the things I tell students to avoid are these things. So first of all, it's using big words. And I always tell students, I don't mean your natural vocabulary. Man, I work with some kids who they are so mature and they have such a sophisticated vocabulary. And again, I want to hear their voice. But I'm talking about that kid, and you may have had them in your class where they pull out the thesaurus and they're like, yeah, I'm going to use this big old word that I can't even pronounce and it's probably wrong. That doesn't work because it's not conversational. If a student wouldn't use a word in their natural vocabulary, they shouldn't be using it. So I will tease kids. I'll be like, when they write, I pummeled my teacher with questions. I'm like, no, you didn't. You might have pestered them or asked them lots of questions, but you didn't pummel them. Too much description. This is not a creative writing piece by any means. And I think some of our students, especially like the STEM kids, they've been looking forward to this creative writing. It is not creative writing. And so if students are over the word count, or, I mean, they'll just have paragraphs describing, it's like, remember, if you're talking to somebody, you would never say the billowing clouds in the distance, waft of roses in the air, or whatever. You just be like, oh, it's beautiful, beautiful scenery, whatever. As I always tell kids, please do not treat it like a paper in high school. These are so different. Sometimes students repeat and ramble. I always tell students, you only need to say it once. Their tone, most kids, I don't have a problem with this, but every once in a while, and sometimes this might come from more of a high achieving student, but they feel the need to brag, like, oh, look at me, I'm so amazing. And I tell kids, I want you to write your essay so the colleges go, wow, that kid is so amazing. But you don't need to be telling them that, because that's off-putting. And some kids whine. Nobody likes a whiner. Some kids can't take responsibility for things that they've done. And again, that's just off-putting, because remember, we want the essays to leave a favorable impression with the reader. And then I have a thing about dialogue, about quotation marks in college essays. It's so off-putting. So 650 words isn't very much. It's one page. And I tell students, well, you need to be really strategic with every word. And so there's nothing wrong with having dialogue in an essay. But if you think about it, if you were talking to somebody and telling somebody a story conversationally, and somebody said something, you would paraphrase it. You would never say, oh, now in quotations. So this is the example I give. You would say, oh, one day I told my best friend about my idea. Instead of saying, I have an idea, I said to my best friend. A lot of students like to do their opening paragraphs with dialogue, and it doesn't work at all. They just shouldn't do it. Just have them paraphrase. So these are the 7 prompts that I mentioned, super generic. Usually when I read a student's essay, I can be like, oh, there's like 4 of them that it matches up to because they're so generic. Some of the things I remind students before starting their personal statement, that no one should tell the student what they must write about. I have some suggestions, and this is specific to college majors, which I'll mention later, but sometimes parents think, they're going to force their student to write about something. And I just always tell the students, this is theirs. And it's so much more authentic if it's their story. And I tell students at the beginning, they shouldn't worry about word counts or prompts, punctuation, any of that. They should just tell their story. When I'm reviewing essays, I would much rather a student had too many words. I can work with that. Oops, didn't do that. I always remind students also, I don't personally, some people might disagree with me on this, but I don't think a topic is off limits. It all depends on how it is presented. There's balance, and students do need to be careful with topics, but I don't think anything is really off limits. And as I said earlier, students need to remember as they're writing this, that they don't know who is reading their essay. They have no idea. And that the person reading their essay knows absolutely nothing about them. And students have a very hard time with this because they're like, well, that's on my application. They see it in my transcript. They see it in my activity list. And a couple things. As I mentioned, college applications are read very quickly. And things like transcript, activities, test scores, that's more of a rubric. Like they're reading these things fast. They're reading lots of applications. And I tell students, sorry, no one's going to remember how many AP classes or what your GPA, when they're reviewing it, sure, there's a form and they give scores and all that kind of stuff, but they're not going to remember it. So when they read their essay, they're not going to go, oh yeah, that's right. That kid took AP chemistry or whatever when they're referencing something. The other thing is many colleges, especially the more selective ones, they separate the essay from the rest of the application. They have 2 different people review parts of the application. So the person reading the essay could very well not have access to the rest. But again, people shouldn't think that they remember that. So that's important for these next 2 parts. So when I look at first drafts of personal statements, there tends to be 2 areas that students typically need to improve upon. And the first one is the opening paragraph. And this is a very important paragraph because it's the foundation of the story. And I tell students, remember, you're telling a story to somebody who knows absolutely nothing about you. So it's similar to a newspaper article or a magazine article. That first paragraph is called the lead. It's got the who, what, where, when, and how. And this next part, this may contradict what you might tell students, because I do hear from students that they're told about this. There does not need to be a hook in a college essay. If a student sets up their paragraph properly, it'll be interesting enough and they will want to read the next paragraph. Sometimes a hook happens naturally, but most of the students' essays that I read, they don't have hooks, and the students are very successful in the application process. And I'm going to show some examples here. And sometimes students will come back and say, oh, I was told I had to have a hook. And I've seen frogs show up in story, the Matrix show up. I'm always like, what happened? And they're like, oh, I was told I needed a hook. Just so you guys know, they do not need a hook. And again, the student should write it as if the person reading it knows nothing about them. And I say a good way to do that is to think about, pretend you're at an interview and you're being asked one of the prompts. How would you answer it? You wouldn't start off with, eek, a lizard ran over my bed. And I've read things like that. So, and the other area students will often make mistakes on is the conclusion. They forget that they have to have one. So think about this from a strategic standpoint. A student is applying to college. The essay is part of the application to help get the student into college. So whatever story, remember, we're trying to reflect on our character and our personality, it has to somehow tie into college or beyond college, because otherwise, why is the student telling that story to a college if it doesn't tie into college? And it's very, very simple to do. So here are 2 examples of essays from a few years ago, successful students. And I'm just going to read the opening paragraph and the concluding paragraph. Obviously, there's paragraphs in between, but I hope you get a better sense of what I mean. So here's the first one. My freshman and sophomore years of high school consisted of me pursuing honors and AP classes, playing varsity soccer, and slowly making new friends. I was satisfied with what I was involved in, and I'd argue that my schedule was to blame for my sleep deprivation. This ignored the many hours I'd spent playing League of Legends or binging Ross and Rachel's Wedding Arc on Netflix. When asked what I wanted to do in the future, I'd say I wanted to become an oral surgeon like my dad. So the kid is just setting up their story. And I love this because I can hear their voice, and he's got some humor in there, and it's all not all cut and dried. And then here's the conclusion. It's hard to imagine that a single goal to meet one stranger led me to where I am today. Washington Business Week taught me so much. The most important lesson I learned is to take initiative. Although I'm no longer as set on becoming an oral surgeon like I once was, I can't wait to explore more of my interests deeply. In college, I look forward to continuing to step outside of my comfort zone, throw off old labels, and seize the opportunities that present themselves. So that's how they tied into college. In college, I look forward, blah, blah, blah. Excellent job. Here's another student. Most 8-year-old girls collect American Girl dolls, but I wanted crisp-like notebooks. My favorite was from my dad's office. It had graph paper pages, a waterproof cover, and Microsoft written on the front. I made it an invention book. In my nicest handwriting, each page was filled with the name of my invention, a labeled drawing of how I imagined it would look like, and a description of what it did. My best ideas were the curved escalator, hammock bunk bed, and the umbrella tutu. My notebook sparked my interest in the science and technology field. And again, it's not that students can't show creativity, but it's pretty straightforward. Excellent job. And then here's the conclusion. My interest in technology and science only grew after this class. I recently designed a more fuel efficient Boeing 737 in engineering class and attended an engineering summer camp. I still have all of my projects, including my Blue Stripe boat and invention book. I smile when I look at them and think of where I am now, a high school senior planning to study mechanical engineering. They taught me creativity, time management, self-reliance, and problem solving. While I have a lot to learn, I'm excited to make the most of the resources and possibilities in college. So I hope you get a sense of what strong opening paragraphs and concluding paragraphs are. I don't know about you, but it makes me want to read the stories in between. So they were good stories. Now, I believe an important ingredient that students need to add to their personal statements is some type of vulnerability. And I will tell you that this makes students very uncomfortable, especially high achieving students. And all vulnerability means is admitting that you aren't perfect. Here's newsflash, I'm not perfect, nobody is. And I don't mean cringy details, that is the last thing I want, but it can just be simple statements like, I was scared, I was wrong, I attempted suicide, my mom's an alcoholic, I was sexually assaulted. I've heard all sorts of things from students, but not the details. And especially the high achieving students, I think that they feel like, oh, I must come off as perfect in my college essay. Well, keep in mind that there are other things that are being looked at in their college applications, such as their academics and test scores and activities and all that. And for high achieving students, they're strong in all that. And I don't mean a woe is me essay, because we still need students to leave a positive impression and all that stuff like that. But I have found in my experience that the students who are brave enough to put some vulnerability in their essays, and I will show you some examples of that in a few minutes too, they tend to be the ones who get admitted to the more selective schools. And I think it's because they're brave. So I strongly encourage students to have a little bit of vulnerability, because courage, when we think of it, whenever we feel vulnerable or emotionally exposed, this is usually our times of great courage. And that's not a bad thing, to show to a college. So I mentioned challenges earlier, and I said I'd talk a little bit more. So no one has to write about a challenge in a college essay, but as I mentioned, they can be a great source of college essay. If a student can look behind them and say, let me show you what I've overcome and who I am now. A couple things. Some students are like, I've never had a challenge. I don't buy that, because no one can get to the age of 16, 17 without some sort of challenge in their life. Some challenges are large. As I mentioned, I've heard some things from students that just breaks my heart, being abandoned by mothers, by sexually assault, parents who physically abused students, sicknesses, depression, anxiety, all sorts of stuff. And then I always tell kids, challenges come in all shapes and sizes. So I've got this crazy curly hair. It can be a challenge. I don't like to eat fish. So if I go to someone's house and they put a big piece of salmon in front of me, it's a challenge because I have to figure out how to be polite when I don't want to eat it. So this is how everybody's had challenges. What I do caution students about challenges, if it's a serious challenge, if it's a big challenge, and they're still wrapped up in it, that they can't look behind them and say, I'm past it. Let me tell you about my journey and where I'm at now. They probably shouldn't write it in a college essay, because the essays are read by humans, and you don't want to set off red flags where an admissions person might say, oh, this might, going to college might be too much, or make this too difficult for a student. So that's kind of my rule of thumb. But the formula is very straightforward when it comes to challenges. I tell students, first, identify the challenge, set it up. What was the effect? And it needs to be negative. Again, not woe is me, not cringy details, but what was the negative impact of this challenge? And if there aren't any, well, then it's not a challenge. That would be an opportunity if it's only positive. So there should be things that are negative. Then what did the student do because of all this going on? And how did it change? How did they grow because of what they did? And sometimes students do want to spend all their time in the second column going, well, woe is me. And it's a litany of this and this and this. No, the magic, especially in a college essay about challenges, is in what did the student do and how did they change and grow? That's where I would spend about 2/3 of the essay. The rest of it is just setting up the story. So this slide, I just remind students, because sometimes they say, oh, Mary Pat, I heard that I can only write about something that happened last year, or I heard that I can only write about something in high school. No, students can certainly write about things from when they were younger. The key is to bring it forward to the current times. I mean, you need to, because it's the student today who's applying. I read an essay yesterday and I have to talk to the student about it, but half the essays, half of the 650 words was describing her learning to ride a bike when she was 5. And as I mentioned earlier, the student's supposed to be telling a story that only they can tell. And it was the same story every kid learning how to ride a bike was. So I need to talk to her about that, because she's wasting her words, and her at 5 is not the same student as she is at 17. And so again, it's strategic. Students should really think about, what do they want a college to know about them? So I mentioned that some colleges have additional essays. These are called supplemental essays, and the same principles apply that I mentioned for the personal statement, but there are some differences. These are specific to a college. So that is where in the conclusion, a student can tie the conclusion specifically to Georgia Tech, University of Washington, Gonzaga, whatever. Often, not always, the word count might be shorter, and some students think that means that it makes them easier. It doesn't. It actually makes it more difficult, because the student has to tell a complete story in whatever the word count is. At more selective schools, these supplemental essays might be weighed heavier in the admissions process. Students have to answer the prompt, whereas before, for the personal statement, I'm like, just tell your story. Not here. They need to answer the prompt. And if they don't answer the prompt, again, at the more selective schools, and if they've got too many qualified students, it can be a reason to reject a student. And students do get tired with writing these. It can be a lot. But I always remind students, please don't waste your words repeating the prompt. And a college should learn something new about a student in each and every essay that they read. And I remind students, don't put them off, because they're hard. But I also encourage students to try to repurpose their stories as much as possible. And that's typically what I see happen. Most students might have, again, it depends on their colleges. Some kids only need a personal statement, but other kids might need some supplemental essays. And if that's the case, I typically see that students might have 3 to 5 stories about themselves, and they reuse them, they repurpose them. The opening paragraphs and concluding paragraphs might be different to match the prompt, but the stories stay pretty similar. So some supplemental essays are noted on college applications as being required, which means the student has to answer them. And then others are listed as optional. Some of the more common optional ones, and kids always laugh at this, but they are on there. It says, are you a convicted felon? If yes, please explain. If a student can answer yes to that, they need to answer it. Or have you ever failed a class? If yes, please explain the circumstances. But if students cannot say yes to either of those, they can skip them. But others might be optional, and it would be in a student's best interest to. It might say something like, in 200 words, describe one of your extracurricular activities and what it means to you. If it's a college that a student actually wants to go to, I would recommend that they answer it. So for example, Northwestern University, which is a highly selective school, they have a why Northwestern, and it says, do you plan to complete it? And it says, we strongly encourage, that students do that. So if a student really wants to be considered, they should answer it. But when you read the prompt there, it says in 300 words or less, help us understand how you might engage specific resources, opportunities, and or communities here. We are curious about what these specifics are, as well as how they may enrich your time at Northwestern and beyond. That's not an easy prompt. So students, as I said, they shouldn't wait to the last minute to answer those. And these are just some examples of supplemental essays. The ones on the left are the more traditional, but some colleges, USC, Chapman, Stanford, they have short responses. And the same principles apply. Again, colleges should learn new things about students. The main thing that I would remind students with the short responses is the word count or character count. So in a supplemental or in a personal statement, I said the word count is 650. If a student tells their whole story in 605 words, that's great. I don't have any problem with that. 575 words, great. However, let's say the question was in 50 characters, tell us your favorite food. And a student thinks, oh, hallelujah, I can answer this one. And they answer pizza, 5 characters. Well, the college doesn't really want to know what their favorite food is. They're trying to learn more about the student. So that's a tell. They still have to back up the show or the explanation, like, why is it pizza? Maybe it's because their, family would get together every Sunday and make it together, and it brings back these warm, feelings or whatever. But so for short answers, I would encourage students to maximize the word or character count. Students don't need to write incomplete sentences. They shouldn't stress out about these. This is a chance to show some personality and character. They can be funny and to show different sides. So if it's an engineering kid, they don't have to be an engineer in every essay. They can show their other sides of themselves. So the University of California has 8 prompts. I don't really call these personal statements or supplemental essays. They're called personal insight questions, PIQs. There's 8 prompts. Students get to pick 4, and they have 350 words for each one. And I always attend the UC's counselor workshops they have every September. And when they talk about these, the things that they always stress, they're like, we're not English teachers. Okay, we're not looking for, English papers. We're just looking for storytelling. That's what they want. And students can pick from here. And then the University of Washington, which a lot of our students do apply to. So they are using the Common App. They are not using the Common App, the personal statement from the Common App with the 7 prompts. They've used this prompt for at least 5 or 6 years. And it's, tell a story from your life, describing an experience that either demonstrates your character or help to shape it. It's 650 words. And again, you hear that word, demonstrate your character or help to shape it. So again, that's, so quite frankly, if a student did that on their Common App personal statement, showing their character and personality, personally, I think they should be able to use it for UW. But if they haven't, then tell them, that's what UW, they specifically say they want to see a student's character. And that's 650 words. And then there's the 300-word essay, describe the world you come from and how you as a product of it might add to the diversity of the University of Washington. And so this is one where a lot of students think, oh, I'm going to talk about, I do classical Indian dance, or I have 2 black belts, or my mom is Jewish and my dad is Muslim, and all this. And I'm not saying they can't, but when students are writing or responding to what I call the diversity or community prompt, and a lot of colleges have this prompt. And I always tell kids, if you ever see the words diversity or community in a supplemental essay, this is similar to the UW one. What colleges want to know and what students have to prove is, are they inclusive? That is what a college is looking for. And there's lots of ways to demonstrate that somebody is inclusive. It can be through race and culture. I've seen it done through gender and sexuality and hair texture and food and size. And I tell kids that there's often two common themes, I guess. And the one, the student starts off not being inclusive. I call them, it's the "Are you a jerk" essay. And they change. And again, that's vulnerability. There's nothing wrong with saying, hey, man, I was not great to start with and I changed. And then the other one isn't so much that the student was the jerk, but maybe somebody wasn't inclusive to the student. They were a jerk to the student. Or the student witnessed maybe someone or a group this happening to, and the student says to themselves, I will never be like that, because it makes such an impact. So I've got two examples. These do both happen to be University of Washington, but that can change very easily. So here's the first one. I'm an American dream child. My parents were born in Mexico. They moved to Seattle for my dad's medical school residency. This is not what most people think of when they hear of Mexicans moving to the United States. Growing up, only Spanish was spoken in our house because my parents believed it would benefit me and my brother. When I started kindergarten, I didn't know any English. I cried the first day and didn't want to return. Eventually, I learned to speak English. It was hard being one of the few Mexicans at school. Other kids called me Beaner and told me to go back across the border. In high school, there were different cliques, including a Mexican one. This group was looked down on by other students. They were stereotyped as living in trailer parks, not speaking English, and supposedly doing drugs. I worried that I would be associated with these things. I started hating my culture and hoped no one knew I was Mexican. I worked hard to prove I was smart, hardworking, and social. Outside of school, we were friends with other Mexican families. We talked about how it felt to be Mexican at a mostly white school. The older girls encouraged me to be proud of my culture and that I speak another language. I started telling people at my school my stories of visiting Mexico and what it was like having a Mexican family. Instead of ignoring me, my classmates were intrigued and wanted to learn more. I've learned not to believe in stereotypes. My diversity is unique and has shaped me. At the University of Washington, I will help educate others about different cultures and show other people to embrace their culture as well. Being different is only a good thing. So this student, I tell students that where the inclusivity starts is the student actually was embarrassed. They did not want anyone to know that they were Mexican. They hid it. And then they learned to be proud of it, share it with others, and they learned that people accepted them. And there's also a lot of vulnerability in this essay. Some of the ones that I read is when they say, this is not what most people think of when they hear of Mexicans moving to the United States. So this student, their dad's a doctor, but I get the sense that they had a lot of comments made to them. And then when they say, I cried the first day and didn't want to return, kids called me Beaner and told me to go back. I worried that I would be associated. I hated my culture. We talked about how it felt to be Mexican at a mostly white school. Again, these aren't ooey gooey details, but it's enough that I think as a reader, you get a sense for what the student has gone through. And this is what I mean by telling a story that only that student can tell. And they did a very, very good job. And here's another one. I always thought the pronoun they described groups of people. When my friend told me they used they, them pronouns, I thought they were crazy. I'd known them to be a girl since I met them and strongly believed there were only two genders, male and female. For the longest time, I avoided them. Their identity went against how I was raised and what I believed in. In Bengali culture, people who are different are alienated instead of accepted. Since the LGBTQ plus community is frowned upon in West Bengal, I gave into bitterness and hate. I closed myself off and did not listen to my friend with an open mind, the very thing I take pride in. At a mutual friend's birthday party, they asked me why I haven't talked to them in a while. I confessed that I didn't agree with their lifestyle and that them as a person didn't live up with my beliefs. They explained their identity wasn't something they could control, and they hoped I could eventually accept them for who they were. Initially, I was infuriated that my friend didn't understand they were a girl. But when I took a step back and looked at the situation, I realized I was wrong. Them trusting me with the truth about themselves should have been celebrated instead of judged. I should have accepted them as a person and not someone who made them feel bad about their core identity. Now I promise to always be an ally. While there are lifestyles that my culture does not agree with, I will never alienate someone for who they are. I'm grateful that my friend taught me about love and acceptance, which will help me add to the diversity of the University of Washington. So this is the story of somebody not being inclusive, and then they changed. And I was very proud of this student, because telling this story took a lot of bravery. Now, this is not the first draft. We had to work together on it because, again, as I always tell students, you don't know who's reading your essay. And this is one that could have gone in either direction. It's similar to when there's a presidential election. I always have to tell them, please don't write about politics, because you don't know who's reading your essay. But the student, they were talk about being vulnerable. They really put themselves out there, and they changed, and that's okay, and that's a beautiful thing, quite frankly. So I just want to give you these two very different examples of community essays, but I actually love them, and when students hit them out of the park, which so many of them do, I'm just amazed at the stories that students share. So hopefully that helps you. Some colleges, again, I realize you probably don't do a lot with supplemental essays, but I felt like I should just at least share this with you in case the kids ask you after class to look at something. But a number of colleges do have the why us. And these essays are really hard for students to write. They're challenging. So the college is basically saying, why do you want to go to our school? And what students tend to do is they focus only on one thing, which is why they want to go to the school. And they tend to be a little bit more generic. Oh, well, your campus is beautiful. You have a strong computer science program. I went to a football game. You have Greek life. You have study abroad. And again, I'm always like, a lot of schools can say that. So they need to be pretty specific. But the part that students forget to balance out with is they need to show the college why they should want the student. The two pieces have to come together. And so, I tell students what they should do is make a list of what is it that they're looking for from a college? What are the specifics? And they're not going to get everything. There's no perfect college. The second column is, what does this college specifically offer a student? And again, this is specific stuff, looking at the curriculum, talking to people on campus and programs, whatever it is. And then how can those two things, what the student's looking for and what the college is looking for, how can those two be brought together? And this is a supplemental essay a student wrote for the University of Michigan, which has a 550-word supplemental essay that basically says, tell us why you want to go to Michigan, and tell us why you've chosen the specific program or college at the University of Michigan. And this is not 550 words. This is simply 2 paragraphs, but the student did an excellent job. So you hopefully get an understanding of how a student has to do this. And you can also see how difficult these are to read. A student needs to do their research. These don't just come off the top of their head. In order to explore my interests further, I want to participate in a variety of programs and extracurriculars. Over the last few years, I've enjoyed painting, writing, cooking, and more recently, baking and blogging. But especially over the pandemic, I've realized the importance of these hobbies in my day-to-day life and the role they play in my mental health. Along with my academics, I look forward to getting involved in organizations and extracurricular activities at Michigan, such as CMYK Design and Hopelessly Yellow. Hopelessly Yellow's mission statement about highlighting the small, happy moments in life aligns with my own motivation behind starting my blog during the pandemic. I connected with the University of Michigan's dual degree program because, along with science through LSA, the STAMP school encourages students to take a variety of classes like woodworking, animation, and product design that I can't wait to try. It excites me to engage with other students from different programs instead of only engaging with classmates within a specific core interest. So that student did a great job. I mentioned earlier that some students may need more than one personal statement. And again, you may not be involved in this decision-making, but just, might be something to add to a lesson. So colleges handle admittance to majors differently. It all depends on the college. For many colleges, getting into a major isn't a big deal. I'll use computer science as an example. So if a kid says, hey, I want to study computer science, there are some schools that'll go, great, you're in computer science. No big deal. Others will say, congratulations, you are in pre-computer science. And then once you complete your prerequisite classes, as long as you've hit the grades and all that kind of stuff, you will be admitted. And then some schools admit freshmen into the program, and it's highly selective. And this happens a lot in computer science. The University of Washington's program is like this. Like it says on their website, hey, you don't get in as a freshman, you're never getting into this program. And they only accept about 23% of Washington residents who apply get into the program. So it's highly selective. So the first question I tell students, do you know your major? And if the answer is yes, and in this case it would be, does the college offer direct admit for freshmen? Now, if they don't, then I always tell kids, no, you don't have to talk about your major in your personal statement. You can, if that's something that is important to you, but you don't have to. But if the answer is yes, like UW, is there a supplemental essay about choosing a major? UW does not. I reviewed the two statements. The one is, tell us the story of an experience that shaped your character, 650 words. And then the other one is that community essay. Neither one of them is hey, tell us why you're choosing this major. And so because it's such a competitive process, I believe that it's in a student's best interest to make the case for what they have done above and beyond taking AP Computer Science and AP Calc and Physics, whatever, but what they have done, because again, most of the students who are applying to that very competitive program have done the same things as far as academics. So that's why I encourage students to, again, show their character and personality through that, but to make a case for why. Other majors that this might apply to would be engineering, nursing. Again, it depends on the school. So that's kind of the chart that I go through with students. And I always say to students, tell your story. And this is an example. This is from a number of years ago. A student that I worked with who very high achieving student, and they were applying to computer science programs, including UW's. And so this is just one paragraph in their essay. 2 years ago, I studied for hundreds of hours for a prestigious high school computer science competition. I solved almost every problem I found from previous contests and consulted college-level textbooks to learn new algorithms and techniques. I felt prepared when the online competition began in December. After 4 qualification rounds between December and March, I was named one of 26 national finalists out of thousands of students. It was fulfilling to see my hard work and passion transform into actual results. That's what I mean about telling their story and telling a story that only that student can tell. It's too, like if they had just said, oh, I competed in computer science competitions and I did well. Well, that is very different than the student explaining what they did. And that's how it's a story that only that student can tell. So some colleges do allow additional information on college applications. One of them is the impact of COVID and remote learning. I'm sure you've certainly seen the impact there. Students have 250 words on the Common App to explain things, but I always tell kids if they don't have something tangible, like if it's just that, oh, it was annoying or dull or boring, and then I'm glad we're back, I probably wouldn't share that. And then there's another, it's up to 650 words, but it's just like, hey, is there anything else about you we should know? And some students have stories, they want to talk about challenges that they've had that they don't want to write their college essay about it, but they want to make sure that colleges understand. I generally tell students it probably shouldn't be 650 words. It should be much, shorter, but there is that. So I often do, or I always do a brainstorming exercise with students about values, because I've talked about how important character and personality, and these are basically a student's values. And so College Essay Guy is a great resource for college essays. You will get, hopefully you get this with the recording that you're being sent, but this is just a values list. And I give this to students and I ask them to pick their top 10. I always tell them, if they did it the next day, they'd probably pick different values, but it's just to get a sense of what is the most important thing to them. And I have them pick their top 5 out of the 10, and their top 3 out of those 5, and then ultimately their number 1 value. Doesn't mean they have to write about it, but they should know what are their values so that when they're writing their essay, they know. So if I were to do this, these are my values. So I just show students that. And then there are essay topics that when admissions people start to read them, maybe when you start to read them, I know when I start to read them, I think, oh, please don't make me read these essays. And it's just because they're cliches. I mentioned the student who wrote 350 words about, how her experience in riding a bike. And it's like, yeah, I've got 2 kids. They had the exact same experience too. Or students who say, oh, I was taking a very difficult class and it was challenging. So I met with the teacher, or I got a tutor, and then things got, and I dedicated myself. Or, oh, sports taught me teamwork and hard work and competition, and all this stuff. Again, it doesn't mean students can't write about these topics, but the key is that they need to tell a story that they are the only person who can tell it. And I'm going to tell you as one of my stories. Thank you for listening to me for this long. That I hope that you get a sense of what I mean. So, and when I tell the story to my students, I always make a point of reminding them, 1, I don't know who's reading my essay. And 2, the person reading my essay knows absolutely nothing about me. And I stress this point because my story starts off with a little bit of a religious connotation. And if I assume that every person who is reading my essay understands Christianity, I'm making a big mistake because I don't know who's reading my essay. So I'm going to take a sip of water here and then tell my story, and I hope you enjoy it. So in the Catholic Church, Easter is the biggest religious holiday of the year. It is the celebration of the resurrection of Jesus. There is a 50-day period prior to Easter called Lent, and during Lent, people are supposed to do things to improve themselves and make themselves worthy of celebrating Easter. And this is when you might hear of people giving up chocolate or coffee and all that. And quite frankly, I never did anything for Easter or for Lent because I don't like giving anything up. But about 11 years ago, I decided to keep a gratitude journal. And the reason that I did is that everywhere I looked, I kept hearing about the neuroscience and the research that they had done on gratitude and how an attitude of gratitude would change people's brain waves and make them happier and all this stuff. And it wasn't that I was negative or depressed. I've always considered myself to be a pretty positive person, but the whole concept intrigued me. And I thought, Lent's coming. I never do anything. I'm going to keep a gratitude journal for Lent. So I was getting ready to start this. And I thought, okay, Lent is 50 days long. I'm going to write 10 things a day so that when Lent is over, I will have 500 things in my gratitude journal. And as I was, again, preparing for all this, I realized that I'm not the kind of person who can use a notebook or a phone to jot things down as something crosses my mind during the day. I would lose my phone, I would lose my notebook. And I also realized that if this meant I had to do it at the end of the day. And at the end of the day, I don't know about you, but I'm usually tired and sometimes I'm crabby. And I worried that I was going to have the world's most repetitive gratitude journal, that every day I'd say, I'm grateful for my husband and my kids and my house and my health and my dogs, food on the table. And I didn't want to do that. I really wanted to try to embrace this gratitude thing. So I challenged myself to do 10 different things every single day, no repeats, so that when Lent was over, I had 500 separate items. And that's what I did. And it wasn't super hard, but there were some things that I had to change about myself. And the first was that I had to increase my awareness of what I'm grateful for, because the reality is a lot of the things I should have been grateful for, I just took them for granted. And the other thing is I have a lousy memory, and I had to figure out a way to remember things at the end of the day when I was writing them down. And I didn't understand this at the time, but now I would call what I did mindfulness. So if you were here in my office, there's a window right here. Outside the window, there's a beautiful magnolia tree, and hanging from that tree is a bird feeder. And if I wanted to be grateful for the bird feeder, it's like I have to stop and turn off my brain to not think about anything else but this bird feeder for about 10 or 15 seconds. And it's like, the bird feeder. I love birds. The tree is gorgeous. Trees and birds are nature. Nature always makes me happy and grounded. And it kind of reminds me that the universe provides. So I kind of go through this thing. And so that at the end of the day, when I'm thinking, what am I grateful for? A picture of the bird feeder would show up and be like, oh yeah, the bird feeder. So I'd write it down. So that's what I did. And it wasn't that, anything magical happened. I didn't win the lottery, but, maybe my husband says, hey, let's get Chipotle tonight and I don't have to cook dinner. Or maybe one of my children did something that I'm really proud of them and to be their mom. Or maybe my backup camera prevented me from, hitting something. So Lent was over. I had my 500 items and I was reflecting on it. And I thought to myself, I didn't think this was possible because I thought I was so positive. But doing this exercise really changed me. I realized that I was happier, that I was able to see the grace, the good, the beauty in things that I never noticed before. And I felt like people kind of enjoyed my company, like they liked being with me more often. And I liked these changes, and I thought, I don't want to stop. So I didn't. So as of last night, I think I'm at 31,500 items in my gratitude journal. It is as much a part of me as brushing my teeth and taking my contacts out before I go to bed. I do repeat, and I probably repeat at least a third of the time, but I am always looking for new things to be grateful for. Now, I could share the story with a college. And I don't know if you guys remember that chart I had that said A, B, C, D. And I said D is not about a challenge. It's not about what I want to be when I grow up. It's simply a story that I want to tell. This is D, okay, the story I'm telling. And I would conclude it by saying, and when I go off to college, I look forward to finding new things to be grateful for. The end. Now, there are some colleges in today's world of hate and negativity. They're going to go, oh my gosh, we would love to have you. We'd like to have a positive person. And other colleges might say, oh yes, we'd like to have you because you're positive. But also that story shows us some other things. Wow, you are very goal-oriented. And when you set your mind to something, you follow through and do it. We can't wait to see what you would do on our campus. Now, I'm very realistic that Netflix is never going to make a movie or a series about the gratitude journal of Mary Pat. However, I am quite confident that nobody else can tell that story. Some of you might have gratitude stories, but I don't think you have that one. And that's what I mean by telling a story that only the student can tell. And sometimes I say it's in the details, but then students think I mean, oh, the woman with blonde hair and blue eyes. No, that's not the details I'm talking about. So I hope that story helps you a little bit. Here's just some last minute tips that I give students. I always tell them to read it aloud. The ear will pick up things that the eye misses. As I said, they don't need to worry about a hook. Check for spelling and grammar. Grammarly is a good tool for students to use. Are you within the word count? There's no going over. You can go less, but you can't go over. They will cut that essay. Are you showing and not simply telling? Are you oversharing? They shouldn't overshare. Check your adjectives and the use of very, so, kids put lots of those type of words in there. Do not say, I was a freshman in high school. I was a senior. And again, they just have to say I was a freshman. They know it's high school because that's where they're at. In supplemental essays, did they answer the prompt? Again, if there's dialogue, is it paraphrased? Again, no direct quotations. And does your essay make sense? Is it readable? That's sometimes when I'm working with students and I start reading it aloud, they go, oh my God, that's horrible. And I'm like, yeah, that's why I tell you guys to read it aloud, because you'd be surprised, because it has to make sense. Think of how fast these essays are being read. It needs to be super readable. And I always tell kids, pay attention to the tense. Simple tense is best. They always want to complicate things. This is a feedback form that I use with my students. You are welcome to make up one like your own. Sorry, I'm blind as a bat here, but so, is it a story that only the student can tell? Does the first paragraph, does it set up the story? Is it the who, what, where, when, and how? Does the concluding paragraph tie into college? Is there showing and telling throughout the whole thing? Can you hear the student's voice? Is there any vulnerability? What are you telling the college? What's the message? And then are there any values shown throughout this? And so I think this can be a helpful form for students. Almost done here. I'm not a big fan of peer reviews for essays, and I'll explain why. You guys can totally disagree with me, and I'm not trying to put more work on people, but I'll tell you why. So first of all, I just don't think other seniors in high school have any business giving feedback to another senior. None of them know what they're doing. So that's my point. Second thing, though, is the vulnerability issue. I'm 60 years old. I will be vulnerable with anybody. I don't have any secrets. Do with my secrets what you want. I'll tell you anything you want to know. But when I was 17, did I feel that way? No. And students have a very difficult time being vulnerable amongst their classmates because they don't want kids to know that type of stuff. And last but not least, applying to college, especially for the more selective schools, is highly competitive. And there is nothing to stop a student from taking another student's essay or saying, wow, that's a good idea. I'm going to use, so I just have a lot of issues personally with peer reviews, but again, handle your classrooms as you will. So the question to ask students is to revisit the question, what do you want a college to know about you? They control every single word of that essay. They don't control the other stuff, but they control the essay. And so they should make sure that the message that they send is the one that they want to hear. That's all I have for you today. I hope you found this beneficial. If you have questions, I'm a resource. If you want me to come in and talk to your classroom, I love talking to kids. I'm always happy to do that. These are ways you can reach me through the foundation or directly at marypat@trueFitCollegeCounseling.com. Thank you for all that you do. I know the kids love their teachers, and your input is really important, and you do so much. So I just want to thank you for that. And please know that I'm here to help. And thank you for listening to me. Have a good day. Bye.